tomorrow will also be the first real day of real oversight hearings in the new democratically controlled House. One thing to watch for, the Armed Services Committee tomorrow in the House is going to convene hearings on the situation on the southern border, and specifically the absolutely remarkable, if now somewhat forgotten fact that the president really did deploy thousands of active duty U.S. troops to the U.S. southern border right before the midterm elections, while he was simultaneously making the case that people should vote in the midterm elections on the basis of the terrible security situation at the southern border. Now, I don't know if that military deployment, if that expenditure of military resources was just done for political effect to try to influence the midterm elections. If it wasn't, it's presumably because the administration has some other reason for that military deployment. The problem with that argument is that the president has had a really hard time explaining what did justify that commitment of military personnel and resources to the border at that moment and in that way. For example, I kid you not, the Trump-appointed senior management at Customs and Border Patrol reportedly sent an emailed request for information to employees of that agency, asking them for any factual backup they could locate to bolster the president's repeated, detailed assertions that part of the crisis at the southern border is that women are being tied up with tape in cars to traffic them across the border while they're all tied up with tape. The president says this over and over and over again. There does not, as yet, seem to be any known factual basis for the president's repeated claims that this is part of the crisis at the border. There also does not seem to be any factual basis for the president's claims that Mexican smugglers have amazing cars like you've never seen before, cars that are better than any other cars that are much faster than the Border Patrol vehicles. And that's why U.S. law enforcement can't keep up at the border, because their cars aren't as amazing as the amazing Mexico cars. We don't know why the president has been saying either of those two things about the southern border. Apparently, the Border Patrol does not know either, and Trump appointees were surveying members of the Border Patrol to find out if there was any factual basis for any of these things the president have been saying. It should be noted that both of those things, the women being tied up with tape and put in cars to traffic them across the border, and the Border Patrol having amazing cars that U.S. law enforcement can't keep up with, both of those things do feature in a new movie, a movie called Sicario, Day of the Soldado. In that film, which is fiction, one of the things that happens is there's a woman taped up in the car. In that same movie, there are also Mexican smugglers with amazing vehicles that are too fast for American law enforcement to keep up with. Also, you know that thing the president keeps saying about the prayer rugs being found in the desert at the border? That's in that same movie, too. Again, all plot points in the same movie, which is fiction. Now, in a normal administration, it would be insane to suggest, to even think about, to even joke about the president of the United States seeing stuff in a movie and him maybe thinking it was real, or at least real enough to justify an actual U.S. military deployment of thousands of active duty U.S. troops to the border. But in this case, women tied up with tape, put in car and driven across border, and the amazing magic Mexican vehicles and the prayer rug thing, they do all appear to be from the same movie rather than from, like, the real world. I mean, is it possible that that is where the president cooked up these justifications for the supposed crisis at the border and the pretense for sending U.S. troops there right before the election? I mean, could that actually happen in real life? I don't know. But for the first time, tomorrow morning, we're about to have actual oversight hearings to try to figure out what exactly that deployment was actually about and whether the president's statements comport with the real reasons that deployment happened. And somehow it is at least comforting to know that somebody may try to take a stab at that. Tomorrow, there's also a really important oversight hearing in the Senate. This is sort of the annual oversight hearing for the intelligence community, and that sounds boring, but what this means in practical terms is that the head of the FBI, head of the CIA, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, head of the NSA, and the Director of National Intelligence All the heads of all the big intelligence agencies are all going to be there in person all at once, answering questions in open session. And I don't expect any of them to break out in buckets of flop sweat like Acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker did today. The heads of those intelligence agencies will be in Congress tomorrow morning in the Senate, answering questions in public session for the first time since the Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin. Think they might have anything to say about that? Since the murder of U.S. journalist Jamal Khashoggi, with the Trump administration excusing the Saudi Arabian government's potential role in causing that death. Even just in the last few days, there have been serious revelations and allegations made in open source public reporting that'll be fascinating to get these chiefs on the record about. There's that NBC News report from Thursday night that there are at least 30 officials in the Trump White House who career officials recommended should not be given security clearances based on what the FBI turned up in their background checks. In at least 30 instances, NBC News reports that a Trump appointee in the White House, a single appointee, overruled those negative recommendations from career staff and nevertheless granted security clearances to these people who are working in the White House. The FBI and the CIA are key agencies for dealing with security clearances overall and for protecting the kind of information that people without security clearances aren't supposed to see. The heads of those agencies will be in open session tomorrow with the Senate Intelligence Committee, presumably available to be asked about that new scandal and whether or not they can justify 30 people working in the Trump White House who would have otherwise been turned down for security clearances, who were nevertheless cleared to be given access to that kind of information. As of yesterday, the Trump administration has gone forward and dropped sanctions on a Putin-linked Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska. He was sanctioned because of Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. He is known to have extensive ties to Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, whose criminal case is very much ongoing at this moment. 136 Republican members of the House, all the Democrats in the House, all the Democrats in the Senate, even 11 Republicans in the Senate, they all tried to block that lifting of sanctions on Deripaska by the Trump administration. They fell 2 Republican votes short in the Senate. And so these sanctions now have been lifted as of yesterday. Since they failed to stop the Trump administration from lifting these sanctions, it has been reported that Deripaska won't even have to give up effective control of his companies in order to escape these sanctions. It's been reported that he may in fact benefit to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars by this lifting of sanctions. Again, he was sanctioned in conjunction with the attack on our election. That matter isn't exactly settled, but now he's getting hundreds of millions of dollars in breaks from the Trump administration, while the Manafort case alone persists in the courts. One Republican senator, Mike Rounds of South Dakota, has suggested that given the subsequent reporting about how well Oleg Deripaska is going to do from the Trump administration lifting sanctions on him, maybe the Senate should look at that again. Maybe their vote to let the Trump administration lift sanctions on Deripaska was maybe a mistake, and maybe they should revisit it. That was a little late from Senator Mike Rounds. But the sanctions now have officially been lifted. We'll see tomorrow if the intelligence chiefs have anything to say about the impact of that decision. NBC News also reported on Thursday that the Trump administration has apparently just decided to not go ahead at all, or at least to not go ahead yet, with the sanctions on Russia they said they were going to impose for the nerve gas attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter in England. Remember that? The Novichok attack? It's been nearly 3 months since the Trump administration announced that they would join our European allies in sanctioning Russia for that nerve agent attack on UK soil. NBC News reported on Thursday night that despite that announcement, no such sanctions have been forthcoming. They announced it and then they just didn't do it. Maybe they're thinking if they just wait long enough, nobody will notice that they never followed through. The intelligence chiefs can weigh in on that tomorrow in open session as well. So there's a lot going on right now. I will tell you tomorrow is going to be a little bit nuts. I will also tell you the next couple of weeks are going to be wall to wall. And now I got to tell you there's just one more thing to watch for. It is a surprise move, a bipartisan move, and not from the usual suspects either. It's a surprise move that may have a major effect on the ultimate resolution of the Mueller investigation and on some of the strongest concerns that have been raised about whether Trump's Justice Department might be able to submarine or keep secret any final report that Mueller produces. Again, this was a surprise development in today's news. It was a bipartisan development, and one of the lawmakers who made it happen joins us next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.